a little bit on that, Sam. You know, so that we get the right perspective, and so that we don't seem to like you're hiding any data from anyone. If you look, for example, the composition of debt, around 4-point-something trillion Kenya shillings, just almost close to 5 trillion is domestic debt. All this debt is dollar denominated. When you projected those figures on the screen just now, what I saw was 9.6 trillion Kenya shillings. You never categorized that domestic is in terms of the local currency and also foreign in terms of the other currencies. So that's the reason I'm saying that you may never have a static figure that is today the same figure and tomorrow the same figure.
Don't worry, Honorable
conversion rate alone of the local currency through the other currencies you've borrowed are variables. So it's always a moving target. But to answer you, we are out 10 trillion.
We'll get to the specifics. I remember I said that we'll get to the nationality of where we've gotten this debt from. But Dr. Rugo, so where are we at? Is there a chance that we have already hit the ceiling and gone beyond?
So first of all, it's important to state that as of now, because of the variation in the dollar and the exchange rate, which has moved quite significantly, we, if not so close, Honorable Dini is saying about 10 trillion, we perhaps may have passed it actually, because that fluctuation has been very significant. A lot of these debt, especially the foreign debt, which is US dollar denominated, the shilling, since when most of it was procured, has since depreciated by almost 20 shillings. From 120 to currently now 140. And if you multiply that, my sense is that we are, and with a ceiling of 10 trillion, my read is that basically we have either reached it, and that's why there was a rush to try and go back to an anchorage, to an anchorage, because my sense is that we have actually passed it, and if we have not passed it by now, by the time another a month or two, I think we will have already surpassed it. Okay. But I think it's important to Is there a risk if we surpass? There's definitely a risk because one is that already you are looking at, of course, going against the legally, but against a legal parameter that has been established. But more importantly, is that the bigger challenge with debt is, and I'm sure we'll discuss about that, is a question about its sustainability, because two things have changed which are extremely important. And I think the Auditor General did speak to a bit of this in her report. One is that 2 years ago, we were giving the ratio as public and public guaranteed debt. Now there's a difference. Public debt is the debt that is procured by the National Treasury on behalf, on behalf of the government of Kenya. But we also have public guaranteed debt, which is debt that government gives as a guarantee for state-owned corporations, for county governments. When we come now to calculating the ratio currently, we have dropped the G part, the guaranteed debt. And that has, in a way, tinkered with the ratios to almost show that we are within sustainability. The second one, and we did discuss this when we were last here, it is not clear what GDP amount we are working with. You remember we had a very heated discussion about it. Because every time you play with, with the denominator, the ratios, and I'm very curious why, the government is very keen on the ratio, on the percentage. Because if you are working with the 13.3 trillion, which is what you have in the CBK as the GDP amount, then we definitely are not at the percentage we are talking about. We are not at 4.4%. We perhaps are slightly higher than that. But thirdly, is that we are getting to a very critical time because first our borrowing is increasingly, whereas the numbers show that we have borrowed more externally as of now, the focus of the current budget is to borrow more locally. In fact, about 580 billion of the 718 is going to be borrowed, 586 to be precise, is going to be borrowed locally. And that is basically, and with the revising of the rate by the CBK upwards, it basically means that government has edged out a private sector from being able to borrow from the banks and from locally, and becomes the only player within the market.
Okay.
All those are measures of distress. And of course, the last one is our ability to pay.
Okay.
So that's the question about, are we in danger? So the surpassing is not just a reaching of a figure, and it is also about the parameters and the factors around it, which basically put us on the red, as it were.
And you try to break that down. Because of what Honorable Nyoro is telling us, let's take a look at the percentages in terms of what we owe different countries. This is the external debt, and 67% of it is dollar-denominated. 20.6% is euro-denominated, 5.3% is Chinese yuan-denominated, while 4.3% is Japanese yen-denominated, while the sterling pound is 2.3%. You may want to know who are these countries that the country owes. And we begin by looking at China. We owe them 70% of our bilateral loans, that is the total of 1.2 trillion shillings, is from China. Now, as of the month of April, it was 856 billion shillings. For Japan, which follows quite distantly, it's 106 billion shillings, which is 8.6%. And then France follows with 105.1 billion shillings, or 8.5% if you like. And Germany, 3.5%, which is 43.1 billion shillings. We'll shortly be looking at more details about that. But let's speak to Senator Okiya Omtatah, because, Senator, you've been very passionate about talking of the debt stock that we have in the country. You actually say it is not as high as is being put in the figures. What should be the real or the actual public debt as of now?
I think we need to look at the law. My guiding point is always the law. You've had the speaker who just went before you came in say that we are going to borrow a lot domestically. On what basis will we be borrowing on the domestic market? Does the law allow these things we call treasury bills and treasury bonds? This thing that we used to borrow money locally, does the law allow it? Because under the law, under the Kenyan law, you only borrow finance development or to stabilize some midterm cash flows, but those should be paid off immediately, should not become part of the public debt. So when we borrow, we borrow to and put it on the public debt, exactly are we trying? Are we saying that our debts are not important? So to determine the public debt, you just need to look at the law, and the law says you cannot borrow unless Parliament allows you to borrow.
Right.
And the borrowing being part of the expenditure then must come through the budget process. So if you look at the last years, our government expenditure is about 6 trillion shillings. So when you give us these figures of 9 trillion shillings and other things, where are we borrowing outside the budget? Are we borrowing outside the law? And I think, and then when you look at budgets and percentage, they're supposed to balance, and the recurrent expenditure should be financed from our taxes. We must finance our expenses, our daily expenses from our taxes. The thing is, my brother, from what I'm saying going on in this country, that we are dealing with a Ponzi scheme, some scam. This thing of borrowing on domestic market is not driven by the need in government, because when the government presents a budget, it's supposed to be balanced. That's what the law requires. And the recurrent expenditure is supposed to be paid fully from our taxes. So why does the government go back to begin borrowing? And if it has borrowed in the short term to balance the cash flows, then as they collect taxes, they should be able to settle it. We should not be having debt. But the issue is that as we say, all money raised by the government is supposed to go to the consolidated fund. The consolidated fund is nothing other than the revenue the government raises. But to get that money out of the consolidated fund, you need the approval of Parliament. You need the supervision of the control of budget. But there's a loophole how you can get that money out. You can create a debt. And because the debt is supposed to be paid automatically as a first charge, then there you go. So these characters are borrowing outside the law locally, incurring debt on the consolidated, factoring debt into the consolidated fund, and they earn huge interests. And these are scams involving people in the treasury, a scam involving commercial banks in this country, a scam involving few well-connected individuals, and a scam that even involves state corporations. You can imagine a state corporation being given money by the treasury to go and run its activities. Then it goes around and buys treasury bills, which means it lends money back to the treasury. The same money it was given for projects, it lends it back to the treasury, and then interests are earned, and then they're laundered through some funny buildings and whatever they come up with. So we're dealing with a major scam that needs to be dealt with. So we should not be having a single coin in what we call domestic debt. All domestic debt is a fraud on the people of Kenya, and we need to deal with it.
Okay. Senator, I hear you.
So when because we must do it through the law. The other day you saw the Auditor General and the Control of Budget when they were appearing before committees of Parliament, saying they don't know what the debt portfolio is. How can they not know? And the Parliament has Appropriations Act. They should find our debt in the Appropriation Act. Anything out of the Appropriation Act is illegally acquired, and they will have no business paying it.
Okay, I hear you, Senator, and we'll be trying to get the opinions from the fellow panelists here in studio. But Daniel, for you, because at the end of the day, like he is saying that taxes are supposed to finance recurrent expenditure, when it comes to assessing the value for money, especially the external debt, are we able to relate it to actual work or projects done in the country? Or it's a whole pot being used to finance different programs?
Sam, I think that is the biggest problem we have about our debt. Debt is not a bad thing, but when it is not used effectively, then it is the reason we're in the hole that we are right now. Now, do we know how our debt is used? No, we don't. The first performance audit by the Auditor General around debt was in 2017, and it was clear that the debt that we acquire was not being used effectively. Part of the fiscal discipline that we need is that when we acquire debt, sovereign debt comes on very, very different terms to allow us as a nation invest. By the time we are repaying, we should not be feeling the pinch of the interest, because the investment that should have gone into that particular process should be able to strengthen us as a sovereign nation. Think about the SGR. It's one of the famous debt contracts. If from the onset it was analyzed for its lawfulness and its effectiveness, it means for the amount of money that was used on the SGR, we should have opened up our corridor completely. That particular railway, let me not use the standard gauge, because I don't think Kenya is a state or a nation that should have a standard gauge railway. We should be way above that, and based on the money that was utilized. It should have been so efficient that nobody thinks within the EAC thinks about any other route other than the Kenyan route. But that's not the case. It's very, very inefficient. It was costly, overpriced, and now we have to repay at a very, very high interest. This goes to the center. How comes we do not know our current debt register based on the audit? The Auditor General, was it last month, declared that, look, I am not able to verify the ledgers against the contracts. Why is there that particular level of opaqueness? And the Auditor General appeared before Parliament. Now, there is no excuse whatsoever for Parliament not to know our debt status. Because Article 211 of the Constitution on borrowing by the national government states, within 7 days after either House of Parliament so requests by resolution, the Cabinet Secretary responsible for finance shall present to the relevant committee information concerning any particular loan or guarantee, including, it covers every aspect of debt. So Parliament, this country for the last, during the campaign period and after Kenya Kwanza took power, we've all been concerned about our debt issues. But the solution lies in Parliament. Clearly, within our Parliament, they are not concerned enough, yet they have the power and the full constitutional mandate to help us get our debt register, get its lawfulness and effectiveness, and thereby assist the Auditor General with all the information they require to give us our debt register. Why are they not moved?
Okay.
Parliament, honestly, so far, for the last, since this constitution, has failed Kenyans, particularly in matters of debt management.
And Honorable Nyoro, because Senator Mtata is raising a question of we should be borrowing based on the Appropriations Act. If you look at the deficit you referred to in the previous year, financial year 2022-2023, initially it was about, is it 860 billion shillings or thereabout? Then when you came in, you revised it downwards slightly. But then how do you explain that the public debt based on the records of the National Treasury, in June 2022, it was 8.57 trillion shillings. Now in April 2023, it's 9.6 trillion shillings. That's an increment of 1.1 trillion shillings. Should it follow the deficit declared, or how does it work?
You have put it correctly, that we should borrow strictly under the amounts that we have passed in the appropriations bill. But there are other things that needs to be looked at some when you are talking about debt. Number one, debt, there is debt that you borrow to pay other debts. Those are called redemptions. And then there is interest payment. So that is too much jargon. So wholesomely to say, when we make a budget, for example, let me refer to this current financial year, the deficit that we declared is around 720 billion Kenya shillings, 0.1. That is the only money that we are going to borrow. And that is the only money allowable for you to borrow. And therefore, we actually follow that. On the issue of, I've been listening to the issues about...
Just hold on. So, because the government is yet to declare the debt status as of June, assuming it will be 9.8, or let's use the figure you said, 10 trillion shillings, if it must increase, it can only go up to a maximum of 10.7 trillion shillings because the deficit is 718?
Let me put it to perspective. Last financial year, that ended in June, the declared deficit was 860 billion Kenya shillings. Around 300 billion had already been spent under Article 223. And therefore, as we look about the deficit that we have, we must look at it in all those components. That yes, there was the recorded deficit, but then over and above that, when we took over, there was another money that had been spent to a tune of 300 billion Kenya shillings. And therefore, maybe that is what we need to look at. But allow me to check on the question about data. And I want to clarify to all of us here that Treasury has been very forthright in declaring all the data around our debts to Parliament. And by the way, when the Cabinet Secretary comes to give the budget highlights, that is one of the statutory documents that he actually submits to Parliament. And therefore, in terms of data, it is there. However, then, if you are to argue the other way around, you've just stated some figures here of 9.6 trillion Kenya shillings. I wonder where that data is from. I mean, government has got data. That data actually comes to Parliament. We interrogate, and that has been the norm. But allow me also some, because there are so many things that has happened around this debate, which I need to clarify. I saw one of the things that you projected over there, and it's good that we clarify. We can get an assumption that China is the #1 debtor of Kenya, because the last slide that you put on the screen was on bilateral debt, which I agree China is #1 in terms of bilateral debt.
Right.
But bilateral debt forms one of the least components of our debt, because the entire bilateral debt is around 1.2 trillion Kenya shillings. And by the way, in aggregate, entirely, Chinese debt in Kenya is just around 9% of the entire debt. And therefore, this exaggeration that we usually have, that we are totally indebted to China, may not be totally accurate. What we need to interrogate is the nature of the Chinese debt. And maybe that is the reason why, if you check the composition of our foreign debt, multilateral debt forms as #1.
Right.
Because of its efficiency in terms of our servicing and its cost, and also in terms of size. Maybe what we need to interrogate in terms of Chinese debt is the nature of bilaterals themselves.
Right.
Because bilateral loans by themselves are only second to commercial debt in terms of expense. They are very expensive. And also in terms of their terms, the terms that we always query, and that is the reason why we are running as a regime away from, or this administration, away from bilaterals, is because of also the conditions that come with bilateral loans.
All right.
Bilateral loans, majority of them are, for example, project loans, where you borrow money from a country, and let me make this point, Sam. You borrow money from a country. Many times I go around with the president, you hear some of the accounting officers, for example, describing some projects. This road is World Bank, this road is IMF, I don't know what. There is no money that belongs to IMF in Kenya. There is no money that belongs to World Bank, and that is the point I want to make in terms of bilaterals. Bilaterals come with specific conditions. For example, let me cite one of SGR. You borrow money from China. That money is no longer Chinese, because it's a loan that you are going to pay.
Right.
But then it comes with conditions, for example, that this contractor has to come from this country, these materials have to come from this area,
right.
These expertise have to come from this area, and that is the reason why we are shedding off these bilaterals to go to more sustainable loans,
right.
Especially concessional loans.
All right. Honorable Nyoro, don't worry, because we still have the figures about the multilateral loans. We'll get to that later on. But Dr. Rugo, there are a few questions that Senator Omtata raises about that it is illegal to borrow domestically for financing of recurrent expenditure. What should be the right thing to do? And why does this, because he says that there are redemptions. And indeed, if you look at even the figures of the domestic borrowing in that month of April, the surplus was about 11 billion shillings because there was a lot of borrowing to pay what was maturing. Yeah. But it keeps growing.
Yeah. Thanks. First of all, I want to... This discussion seems to be, creating more confusion.
Right.
And in the sense why it's creating a bit more confusion is because the numbers we have are numbers from the Central Bank of Kenya, which is an agent, the banking agent for the government, and is the one that receives all these monies. So I think, it's just right to acknowledge that that's the only source of information that we can quote. We have no other source of information. Looking at the reports of Parliament, including the reports from the committee that Honorable Ndidi chairs, they raise similar questions actually around just even the ability to know which projects are where and how equitable distributed. In fact, one of the asks they made to the National Treasury was that by September of 2023, that they want to see a report of what projects have been funded with what money first of all, and where are they distributed across the country? Because that's a big question around the equity discussion. But secondly, to know at what point are these projects, so that then to know whether there is, first of all, who is doing them, whether there is duplication, and at what level are they are. But let me come to the question. Parliament, and this one has surprised me, hearing it from Senator Omtata, because what is submitted when the budget policy statement comes, and I think it's important to clarify this, when the budget policy statement is submitted, and this is a document that is submitted in February, long before, in fact, that if you were to argue, that is the point in which the budget is made. Because at that point, the Budget and Appropriations Committee, and then these documents are sent to the Finance and Budget Committee in the Senate,
right,
presents the budget policy statement, which gives you the overall ceilings of expenditure and also of revenue. At that point is when the deficit is determined. Parliament approves the budget policy statement. That's one. Two, when the estimates of expenditure and revenue are submitted in April, which then is what creates a big story around how much you spend, again, Parliament now by vote does approve it. By that virtue of approving a deficit, Parliament approves a borrowing. Because then the borrowing is distributed. And those reports come to the House. So we cannot absolve the role of Parliament in approving public debt. Right. Now, what is not provided at that is provided now in the medium-term debt strategy is where these monies will come from. Some of it will come from borrowing domestically, and some of it from borrowing externally. And the figures, 586 versus 218, as I said, is it 218 or 220 there, for this particular financial year, that brings it to about 718 billion, if we were to use the deficit of the current financial year we are. And therefore, to that extent, which part of it is illegal? Because we can debate about the accountability of how this money has been spent, where it has been spent, how much of it has actually gone, and that, I bet, is information I would be happy if Parliament, because they're asking for the same information we are asking. But we, Honorable Dean here, Okia Omtata, we cannot look like we are on the same side, in the sense that they are in the offices where they can get this information. Right. They can provide this information, including the questions of how much debt do we actually have right now? Where has it been spent? Who has benefited in terms of the kind of services? Because that's a critical discussion. If I was so the legality of the borrowing, I think it's debatable. Of course, there is a 5% of overdraft, which every in every year government is to meet short-term cash flow challenges. We can discuss the accountability of how, and fiduciarily in terms of how that has been applied. Right. But in terms of the legality of the amount that gets borrowed, I think Parliament does approve, unless we are saying Parliament then does not do their job. The committees, the respective committees, do not do their job. The bigger question is around the accountability. These billions and trillions that we are talking about, where have they been spent? Right. Have they been spent in the right places? Have they been spent in areas where basically improve service delivery? And that too is a responsibility of Parliament. Right. So all this debt that we are talking about was approved by Parliament at one point or another.
And the explanation he gives that the reason why the deficit declared versus the actual accumulation of debt, they are different, and he refers us to Article 223 that allows government to spend what is not budgeted for. Does it settle that question?
First of all, that's what I'm saying. There is an accountability question and how prudent that has happened. Two, we have actually seen some spending and borrowing that happens outside and then is legalized through supplementary budget. And we can go into a longer conversation around that. Three, through the supplementary budget, we have also seen, and I was just looking at the numbers here, we have also seen year on year where the deficit is actually revised upwards. Let me just give you an example. 2018-2019, the deficit was 608. Within the year, it was revised to 760. 2019-2020, 673. Within the year, revised to 953. 2020-2021, it was 898. Within the year, revised to 976. 2021-2022, 991, revised to 1.03 trillion. 2022 is the first time when it was 860, then 833, and then finally we settled at 824. It's the first time, like, for instance, you have revised the deficit downwards. But even as you see the numbers that have just been released, we still missed some targets, even in terms of revenues that were expected both from. So there has been certain processes that have been unprocedural. Some corrected by supplementary budgets that are brought into Parliament as late as, and his committee has actually questioned that, as late as 4 days. I think the most was 26th of June, 4 days to the end of a financial year, which basically was a course correction
Okay. Now, let's take a look at how much we owe some multilateral organizations. And for instance, so the total is 2.4 trillion shillings. This is still part of the external debt. What we owe IDA, that is World Bank, is 1.4 trillion shillings, which is 60% of the multilateral loans. For ADB, Africa Development Bank, it's 489.5 billion shillings, which is 20.3%. For IFAD, International Fund for Agricultural Development, is 1.4%, which is 32.7 billion shillings. For IMF, it is 325.5 billion shillings, which is 13.5%. And this is quite particularly interesting because it rose by over 100 billion shillings between the month of March and the month of April. Let's take a look at something else that is also concerning this. For the commercial loans, that's still part of the external debt. We owe the international sovereign bond, the Eurobond holders, 964.9 billion shillings. For the commercial banks, these are external ones, 301 billion shillings, which is 23.5%. And again, the total commercial component is 1.28 trillion shillings. So yes, Honorable Nyoro is right that it is slightly lower than, that is the bilateral loans are slightly lower than commercial, but also half of what we owe the multilateral institutions. And Senator Omutata, you spoke about the question of being owed, being at the mercy of these international organizations like the IMF. And you see there, the much we owe them, now at over 300 billion shillings, but also they appear to come to the rescue of the government, at especially times of need. Why would you advocate for Kenya to dissociate themselves, or the country dissociate itself from IMF? And what then would we be doing to ensure that we're able to finance some of our challenges from these organizations?
I think we need proper fiscal discipline. We need to live within our means. The very idea that we are bringing a budget with a deficit to be approved and approved with a deficit is against the law. If you go to the Public Finance Management Act and the regulations under it, the budget must be balanced. It's a requirement of the law. So there should be no deficit. The idea of paying for loans, repayment of a loan is a recurrent expenditure. And that's why it must be balanced in the estimates. I've heard Dr. say that Parliament approves the revenue estimates. I want him to do, I don't know if he has ever seen them, or is he referring to this document, the Statement of Actual Revenues and Exchequer Issues, which the Treasury publishes, but it never goes to Parliament. There is an opaqueness in terms of revenue. Parliament has never approved domestic borrowing in any form, because the law is that anything you borrow must be tied to a project, a development project, except for short-term cash flow corrections, which should not become a debt. So what I'm saying is that we get to the mercy of these vulture organizations like IMF and the World Bank when we mismanage the economy. And they're basically vultures who come like to eat carcass. You've killed yourself, so they come in, and that's what they do. And that's why I'm saying we should get away from it. And I think I liked what my brother Mheshimiwa said, Lindi Nyoro. about these debts. And I think you were referring to what they refer technically to as appropriation in aid. These are the loans whereby they give you a loan, they give you, they factor the loan to you, they don't give you the money. They come and do their projects here. Parliament has no say. The control of budget has no say. And this appropriation in aid kind of loans are a major scandal that we need to deal with. And one of the biggest culprits is the African Development Bank. You may be cheated by the name African Development Bank. It's not African Development Bank. Who are the investors? The shareholders are the European, the Chinese, the Americans. They just hide under the umbrella African Development Bank. But they use that organ to steal from our economies. So they'll give you, even if you look at the current loan that have been approved, you'll find that this thing, the loans they call appropriation in aid, which they control, they don't release money to come to this country, they don't release money to go to the consolidated fund, is a major avenue of stealing from us. And I use the word stealing deliberately because that's what happens. So that our laws are unable to then deal with, to control how this money comes. You cannot even talk about value for money because you are just tied to these countries. And I'm happy Mheshimiwa Ndindi is talking about it in terms of getting the country to move away from it. But me, the bigger problem I have is the domestic borrowing, whereby there's collusion between the local...
Senator, Dr. Rugo just explained that when Parliament approves the deficit, then you're also approving the domestic borrowing because the component of how much will come from the domestic market is there.
Parliament cannot approve a deficit because the law requires that the budget should be balanced. And I think the thing you are trying, I think that has Dr. ever seen revenue estimates presented in Parliament? Yeah. Even in the current budget, are they there?
What's your answer?
And the budget policy statement, and you should not confuse the budget policy statement with the budget. And he said a statement that the budget is a budget policy statement. No. The budget policy statement, first of all, is not a requirement of the Constitution. It's a creation in the Public Finance Management Act. It's not a requirement in the Constitution. The Constitution in Article 221 begins with Article 220, defines what a budget is. And then we go to Article 221, it tells what kind of estimates the Cabinet Secretary should bring to Parliament. The Cabinet Secretary then deliberately brings half the budget, only expenditure. He doesn't disclose the revenues. And then when you get this article called, which Dr. may be referring to, Statement of Actual Revenues and Exchequer Issues, that is not brought to Parliament. It's kept in the Treasury. And that's why those figures is drawing them from. They are not approved by Parliament. So even the current budget, can he show and point to a place where estimates of revenue are given? Even in the Appropriation Act, can he show us where the Appropriation Act has approved revenues to be raised from Kenyans?
Okay.
They're not there.
All right, Senator, let's get some feedback from here. Diana, is this process too complicated?
Yes, let me first acknowledge it's a very complicated process, and it's part of the problem why we are here. That because of its complexity, and it is also a very time-bound process. Now that we've gotten to a very difficult corner, it is when everybody is interrogating. But as we say that, luckily today I'm amongst people who understand the figures, so all I will read is the law.
Okay.
And on budget-making processes, yes, our Constitution requires that we must have estimates of revenue and expenditure, and they differentiate between recurrent and development expenditure. Most of the deficit is, according to the Public Finance Management Act, ought to be for development expenditure. But 220B says the budgets of the national and county government shall contain proposals for financing any anticipated deficit for the period to which they apply. So our Constitution does envisage that we will have deficit. Ultimately, if we grow and become, we can become such a wonderful economy, Gituko, that the government has surplus and they are giving money, grants to media houses like yourselves to educate the people, to civil societies like Dr. Rugo, so that they build capacity on budget. But we do anticipate that we can have a deficit. The minute that is approved by Parliament and the medium-term strategy paper, debt strategy, and all these are approved by the whole House. Remember, this is both a legal and an economic and accounting process. So you must read both of them together. Once that is done, what is lacking is the prudence and accountability of when you're borrowing. What are the terms? What is the utility? Does it go to development as is required? The PFM Act requires that if you do short-term borrowing, it does not say borrow externally or locally. Whatever you borrow can go into development. Now, there's definitely a challenge in the Kenyan context because most of our infrastructure bonds, you cannot pin them down to this particular development project. That definitely is problematic. But in terms of whether that borrowing has been allowed, and according to the Public Finance and Management Act, which has fallen over here, I had it, the requirement there in that particular piece of legislation is that short-term borrowing for liquidity. We also anticipate that there's a time checks will not have cleared, like any other entity. Very, very short-term borrowing that goes into that and the overdraft. Are there times that both the county government and the national government have exceeded those particular limits in terms of non-development expenditure borrowing? Yes. Have we gotten ways of sealing that? Not yet. So we have a certain reality that means we are operating outside the law. But in terms of whether the borrowing is approved, it is approved by Parliament, and that is why I keep going back. Parliament is not just about the register, the data. It is everything about our borrowing. They can ask about anything. When it is reported that we imported nails, we imported labor and sand for SGR from a bilateral partner, that is problematic for this nation, and those conditionalities should have been questioned and can be revoked by Parliament. Parliament, in that sense, continues to fail us. When infrastructure bonds are not clear, the strongest institution to raise questions on that particular accountability is Parliament. When IMF, there is all this discussion that they're responsible for imposing these taxes. If the executive and treasury listens to them, and Parliament also listens to them, we stop blaming the IMF and we blame our parliamentarians because they have all the power to safeguard Kenyans from improper, imprudent, oppressive and extractive fiscal policies, whether on debt, whether on taxation, in terms of the power they have around our public finance management. I think that's where the main problem is, as opposed to say that debt has not been approved. It is approved, but it is not questioned. It's not properly oversighted.
And I would want to hear from Senator Mtata before I hear from you. Specifically,
can I respond to the question he asked me?
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So if, and I'm sure he has seen this, part of the documents that come to Parliament, and if then parliamentarians don't look at them, I think I'm surprised, is that there is an estimate of revenue, grants and loans, and I'm looking at the 2023-2024 one, that outlines all these amounts, like in detail. I'm just looking at it here. It's on the Treasury website and anybody can download it. And that gives you estimates of revenue, grants and loans, where they will be coming from, taxes of income, profits and capital. Basically, it breaks down these types of revenues and grants and loans, and where they will be by source. Actually, and that's a document. So yes, I have seen the document. I know what I'm saying. Right. The question is, if Parliament does not look at those documents, and I'll be surprised the chairman of the budget committee is right here, and he can confirm that these are actually within the documentation that is provided. Because I don't think we can sit here and say that and say that the other documents we can refer to, the only documents we as citizens of this republic can refer to are documents published by our government, and where we have questions which we have raised. And actually the Budget and Appropriations Committee reports, some of them are raising the same questions we are raising about, are these targets too ambitious? Are they achievable? Where are these projects? You remember, let me just give you an example, that we actually don't have a system that matches projects to spending and level. That was what e-promise, which was launched by the Honorable Uhuru Kenyatta when he was finance minister, and never came to light. Basically, that's what it was supposed to do. So that you're able to tell this project is being financed by loan money and is in this location, it's geo-mapped, and it's at this particular level. That is not there, and that's what the committee actually is asking right now as we're talking here. So yes, the documents are there, Senator, and I have seen them.
Okay, I'll get to you, Honorable Nyoro, but Senator first, because the conversation then is about how much power Parliament has. From your experience, observing but now sitting in Parliament, is there a possibility, maybe you can just move closer to the right of your screen, or is it the left? the right, yeah, right there. Yeah. So is there a possibility that actually Parliament can say, no, you're not going to take these bilateral loan because of the conditionalities?
First of all, I would like to, before I get, I have to correct one misconception. My sister has referred to the deficit in 220B. But what is that deficit? And what are the proposals for financing the deficit? The deficit is what accrues out of the development requirements. And that's the one that is then funded by loans which Parliament approves. The deficit is not on the recurrent part. In fact, the recurrent part also finances development projects. I mean the taxes. Taxes finance recurrent and development. But loans must strictly finance development, and therefore, that is why the reference to the deficit is what else do you require to balance your budget, including your development agenda, and you are allowed to borrow to finance the development agenda. We don't finance our development agenda 100% from loans. A big part of it is financed by our own revenues. So the deficit referred to is the one covered by the development loans. There's no other deficit in the budget. The budget must balance. And that one, if you look at sections 35 and 37 of the Public Finance Management Act, as read with the regulation 33 of the Public Finance Management Regulations 2015, it's very clear that the budget must balance. And the deficit in the budget is a deficit from your taxes. After you've raised your taxes, what's the deficit you have? And that's when you have the development loans. So there's nothing like a deficit coming in for recurrent expenditure. And the budget policy statement is also just a guideline to formulate the budget.
Okay.
The statement is not, and statement have to have any validity. They must come through the revenue estimates presented to Parliament for Parliament to approve. The main problem is that the executive is not allowing Parliament to do its work. It's holding back the issues and rushing this thing through, and that's why then you come without Parliament having appropriated the revenue side of the issues. Then they can go on a borrowing spree on the domestic market to finance whatever they want to finance.
Okay. All right, Senator.
Yeah, so that, and so back to your question. Just clarify to me again.
I was asking you if it is possible for Parliament to say no to government on some of those loans, like the bilateral loans.
Yes, Parliament should be able to say no to those loans, but you'll find that sometimes some of these loans are take the example of the Eurobond. It was taken without parliamentary approval. It was never in any budget.
Okay, I think we're having challenges with the connection.
And Parliament has always approved the appropriation bill. And that's why I'm telling you, government is borrowing outside the law, outside the Appropriation Act. When it borrows outside the Appropriation Act, Parliament has got no capacity to control it. So what is in the Appropriation Act? Even the issue of telling us that they have
Sorry, Senator Okiya Omtata, we're having challenges hearing you. Let's try and reconnect so that we can improve the connectivity. But as we continue the conversation, I wanted us to take a look at the rating, the sovereign credit rating of the country at the moment, and different agencies continue to rate the country. Moody's is the latest with a B3 rating, which is, the outlook is under review. This is then for Standard & Poor's, it's at B, negative. For Fitch, again, it is B, negative. Of course, very technical classifications. And Honorable Nyoro, I know there are many issues that you don't respond on, but also help us understand what exactly that means and how this is informing the decisions of the government in shifting focus from the international market to domestic.
One is that we don't need to be so distressed or be too anxious, because our credit levels now are not in distress. We are not in a very bad shape. However, we can do better. And that is why all the things I have been enumerating here, we are doing them so that we try as much as possible to stop the over-reliance on borrowed money and to start now focusing internally in terms of our revenues. But even to understand the same, allow me to respond to other issues, because they are more related even to the Standard & Poor's and the other ratings. First of all, today I think I'll go home a very devastated member of Parliament, because I thought we all understand our duty as members of Parliament, not just in terms of appearing on TV, but also judiciously taking time to peruse all the documents that come to Parliament. I was very shocked to hear my brother, a senator, talking about documents that are not presented to Parliament, yet he is very aware that by the time the Treasury CS comes to read the budget highlights, he brings voluminous documents, and all the documents that he has been purporting are not available. I want to request him that tomorrow, very early in the morning, he gets in touch with the Parliamentary Budget Office, and I'm sure he'll be able to get all those documentations. Number two, you know, you have framed this show like we are responding to my brother Okiya Omtata. But unfortunately, we are responding to hearsay and misinformation. Number one, he just talked about African Development Bank and insinuating that this is a Western institution. I want to request Honorable Omtata to read much more. The biggest shareholder of African Development Bank is actually Nigeria. And top five of the five of the top shareholders of ADB are actually African countries. Nigeria is there, Egypt is there, South Africa is there. Even going down the line even to number 10, you'll get even Ivory Coast is there. And therefore, it is good that we be factual even as we relay the information here. Number three, allow me also to go back to an issue that has been back and forth. I give you several reasons in terms of this is the money that had been projected to be borrowed. Why have you borrowed this much? I give you two reasons, and I want to add the last one. If you read the Constitution of Kenya, Article 221, Section 7, it enumerates very well on the exemptions of the items that may not necessarily be in the Appropriations Act. And some of those are pending bills, number one. That's what forms the first charge. And repayment of debt is actually part of what forms the first charge. And those are exemptions in the Appropriations Act. and bill. And lastly, the deficit. We've been talking about deficit, what informs this and that, revenue-raising measures, and I'm sure Dr. Rugo was able to bring that information to the good senator on the information that he needs to get in terms of the anticipated borrowing and also in terms of the revenue-raising measures. But I also want to put perspective between the BPS and the appropriations bill. MTDS is the one that informs the BPS.
You risk losing the viewer. Please say that in full.
Medium-term debt strategy informs the BPS or is part of the BPS, not necessarily the appropriations.
Budget policy statement, you mean?
Yes, a budget policy statement, sorry. The one that Dr. Rugo was referring to that comes around February. And therefore, it's not all the information that actually features in the Appropriations Act. Lastly, what is a budget? Because sometimes we can use all the jargons. Budgets are projections. There is no static budget anywhere in the world. You make budget in anticipation that I'm going to do this kind of project because I'm going to raise this kind of money. And therefore, we must not debate like whatever is in the budget is cast in stone. And that is why we always have supplementary budgets. Supplementary budgets, and even the last one that was being touted here came 4 days too late in the night. Yes, it came too late in the night because you needed to standardize government financials.
Okay.
It can even come the last day so that we are able to have the right financials within the government. And if you check even the last one, the bulk of what it did is actually to cut expenditure. Because by the time you are crossing the year, you are very factual. You are nearing the truth in terms of what you are actually likely to correct.
Right.
And it's therefore good to align the government books so that you reflect the right figures in terms of not just the wrong whole projections, but also in terms of the figures that are coming closer home.
And I want us to wind up because...
And please, lastly,
yeah.
I've had my brother Okia Mtata bashing all the time IMF and the other multilaterals. My brother Okia Mtata, Kenya has 3 facilities with IMF. There is the Extended Fund Facility, there is ECF, EFF, and RSF. That is the Resilience and Sustainability Fund. The conditionalities given by IMF, I want to bring this forth to my brother Okia Mtata. Whatever we are doing as government is not in response to IMF. It is also not in response to any of our creditors. It is actually in response to our policies. Take, for example, the issue that IMF always emphasizes around parastatus, state-owned enterprises. Whether IMF was there or not, we were to reform our SOEs. We were to reform Kenya Power. We were to reform KQ. We were to reform all our SOEs so that they become assets, not just in terms of the valuation, but also in terms of the revenues. They start hemorrhaging money, and they stop hemorrhaging money from the exchequer and start being income streams. So this is not just a conditionality from IMF. It is our own conditionality. Number 2, the other conditionality they give, it is around recurrent expenditure. Whether IMF is here or not, we are already in a consolidation path because we have realized we can spend much less in recurrent and still run an efficient government.
Okay. All right. I want us to wind up by looking at, because currently the budget is 3.68 trillion shillings, and the hope is to raise the 2.92 trillion shillings in revenue locally, but also the Kenya Revenue Authority just recently released the figures for the financial year 2022-2023, hitting 2.166 trillion shillings. But now hoping to raise 2.78 trillion shillings in the year 2023-2024. That's a jump of 602 billion shillings, or 27% if you like. If you look at the analysis, the past 5 years, Kenya Revenue Authority's growth in revenue has been 37%. On average, it's about 7%. How possible is it, Dr. Rugo, that Kenya Revenue Authority is going to have this leap of faith and collect 602 billion shillings extra?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to say that I think all analysis, including by the Budget and Appropriations Committee, is that's very ambitious. The leap, and I think you can look at, it depends on whether you are including both ordinary revenue and the revenue that is collected by the ministries, because the ordinary revenue is around 2.57 trillion. And this year alone, having reached ordinary revenue, again, it was about 1.9 because we missed about 110 billion the past financial year in terms of ordinary revenue. So you're saying basically that you are trying to raise, and you're right, it's about you are trying to raise an extra 600 billion based on which is about 17% increase. My thinking is that is very ambitious. It's extremely ambitious because we have been on average of 10% in the last about 5 or so years. But the second reason why I am concerned that it's too ambitious is because we are also in a state where the economy is not performing at the levels it's supposed to be performing. You have a situation whereby income, because revenue collection is a large factor of incomes. You still don't have a situation where there is improved incomes or creation of more incomes, as it were, and that's a big concern. We have not recovered from the COVID era, and if you look at the numbers that have been going down in terms of income streams, income tax has been one of them. Either have stagnated, but basically going down as a share. So I worry that it will be a bit difficult, particularly because also we seem to have our revenue target being driven by our expenditure targets. What we had expected of this government, and they actually did commit at the beginning of it, but then changed tone, was actually to cut expenditure. Instead, we have had actually an increase in expenditure by almost about 400 billion in this current financial year, and therefore the revenue targets seem to be, it's basically like saying, now I earn 500 shillings every month, but because I plan to spend 1,000 shillings next month, my income, almost by faith, is going to be 700 shillings. I don't think that is informed. And this is even from the reports of the committee, and any analysis that we have done, which does not suggest that you have a new income stream. And when you look at even the taxation measures that we are putting in place, I think they send a very different picture, as it were. I wish we set the target based on reality of the economy, as opposed to as a deficit fixing measure. Because as you know, the only way you fix a deficit or fiscal consolidation is either raise your revenue or reduce your expenditure. Or reduce your expenditure so that then you borrow much less, as it were. That's my concern. But my second concern, because you said we are closing this, is we have a challenge with accountability and where the money is being spent. And the more I listen to the current government, and I'm happy that a chair is here, there's still not much language of pushing for accountability of how public resources are being spent. Let me give you an example. He's talked about fiscal consolidation. He's talked about the reform of state corporations. You'll remember that we had the is it Abdikadir? I forget the full name. Commission that looked at the task force that looked at state corporations, harmonization, that whole process. And the reason why this is important is because state corporations spend about 30%, 28% to be precise, of our budget in different forms. And all you see is transfers, and you're saying that many of them are either non-performing. But since then, actually, the state corporations, the number has increased instead of reducing.
Right.
And therefore, you don't see an effort, to consolidate them, to merge them, to even perhaps... Kenya Airways is an interesting one. Because Kenya Airways is the only business that reports losses, yet operates at full capacity and is expensive too. That has always baffled me. And we are always bailing it out through a supplementary budget, 20 billion here, 30 billion here, and currently I think now we bailed out in the last 2-3 years, almost 80 billion as it were. So for me, the concern around matching, the talk with action and going hard and saying we cannot continue with this trend. But the problem with state corporations is beyond just the money they are spending.
Right.
Is the fact that a lot of them also are performing functions that are county government. in nature, whether you think about all the state corporations in the agriculture sector, whether you think about the ones in water, whether you think about the ones in trade and investment. All of these are, a lot of them, they are performing county government function, but because they belong to the national government, and that means then you don't have a wiggle space in terms of how much money you can provide to counties to perform their functions.
Okay, all right. I really want us to close, but not before looking at these key factors that we must remember, that the inflation rate in June stood at 8.77%. This is before what has happened to the prices of fuel, which may push the inflation up. The economic growth is projected to be at 6.1% by the National Treasury. Kenya Revenue Authority is targeting to raise the revenue, to increase the revenue collection by 27%. The growth for the last 5 years has been 37%, on average 7.4%. So, Diana Gishengo, in closing, your thoughts about the ambitions of the government, of the agencies like KRA, and how that is being married with the reality that Kenyans are going through?
We are definitely in an economic crisis, and therefore to get particularly out of the debt crisis, we must show up revenue, make fiscal adjustment so that we are not spending at the rate and levels we were spending before we got into this particular crisis. But ultimately, before we get into projecting new areas of revenue collection or taxation, the entire economic landscape must be readied for growth. And growth is not driven by capital fundamentalism of the state. I think Dr. Rugo has already indicated that part of our current borrowing landscape for the public debt has taken away critical resources for the public sector. Private sector, sorry. So for us to get the required economic growth, to drive revenue up, the private sector must grow significantly. They must create jobs. We must have industries. I like what is being proposed about value chain addition in critical sectors, but we have not seen that particular investment in terms of policy. As it were, right now, the proposals for revenue collection, in my opinion, are extremely ambitious and a bit misguided for a government that is in its first year in office. Elected and with a clear plan, they have their own target and ambitions, but they also have a certain reality to address. Part of the reason we have to show up revenue is because of how much money has been stolen and wasted. If we do not seal the leakages of misappropriation and theft, even if KRA hits this target, we will not pay the debt. We will only fill new pockets. Now, introducing such measures at a time when government essential services are struggling, when the economy is struggling from multiple crises, with low confidence because of weak governance structures, only breeds resistance and lethargy from the people. So I wish the government invested first in strengthening governance for transparency and accountability, show up all the non-compliance on existing taxation, then progressively expand and deepen the tax base, as opposed to these ambitious. Think about the turnover tax, for instance. It has been at 1%. What has the compliance been to warrant it to move to 3% and imagine there will be greater compliance.
Right.
So there's a huge contradiction in the proposals by government, but we all understand we must invest in this country using our own taxes. But before we do that, there must be prudent expenditure and a climate for economic growth.
Okay, Honorable Nyoro, I want to give you the final word because as you are setting out for the start of this financial year, yes, Gary, giving a target of 2 point...
Is it possible I respond to Honorable Nyoro before he gives the final word?
Oh, okay, all right. Go ahead, Senator Mtata, but specifically on the ambitious target to raise the revenues to 2.7 trillion shillings. How possible is it given the current circumstances?
Well, I'll begin by saying that, first of all, a supplementary budget is supposed to address, it will be used only in two conditions: unavoidable and unforeseen. And unforeseen could be things like the pandemics and what happened. Unavoidable, maybe unavoidable, something happened within your budget. And so to like an extent of 10% of the original budget or per item. Not what is happening today that we are doing an supplementary, the way we are doing. Also, an Appropriations Act should contain the information he's telling me to go and collect from his office. All Kenyans are not going to troop to the budget office to look for this information. The information should be in the Appropriation Act. We should be able to see the revenues, estimates being appropriated, and we should be able to see the expenditure estimates being appropriated. Also, the ADB, I think Nigeria owns only 8% of the shareholding in ADB. But anyway, that's not the most important thing. So in terms of raising the extra money that is trying to be raised, you should look at what kind of economic situation are Kenyans going through. And so the choice should be between killing the goose that lays the golden egg or allowing the goose to continue an egg a day. The ambitious succession is not sustainable. And as I told you, even our neighbors are doing much better than we are doing. I just told you about the depreciation of the Kenyan shilling against the Uganda shilling at a very alarming rate. Uganda is our neighbor on the same continent, so there must be something we are doing wrong.
Okay.
As for the IMF, we have got the IMF Act, we have got the Bretton Woods Act in our statutes. One only needs to look at those statutes, those laws, and see what position the IMF enjoys in terms of micromanaging the policies my brother has been referring to. Those policies that are being pushed, of course, they express themselves through policies.
Right.
But should we pursue these policies at the expense of killing the economy? We saw the structural adjustment programs and what they did to this country. We have not even recovered from them. So for me, we cannot operate outside the law.
Okay.
The Appropriations Act carries estimates, but are estimates bound by law.
All right,
we
Senator.
We cannot just go and begin running outside the law. And we have ended up to a point whereby, right now, our debt is bigger than our development agenda. It's because of that operating outside the Constitution and the law. Let us see the estimates that are supposed to be in the budget.
Okay.
Let us see an appropriation carrying both revenue and the expenditure estimates and the deficits covered that are already covered in the borrowings that we do.
Okay.
And let us operate within our means.
Okay. All right.
And I think the way we are trying to operate outside our means will not allow this country to grow.
All right. Thank you so much, Senator Okiya Mtata. Now we have to take the final word from you, Honorable Nyoro. And I wanted to ask you about, so the target for KRA is 2.7 something trillion shillings, 2.768 trillion shillings. The president wants them to raise 3 trillion shillings by June 2025. The Finance Act 2023 was targeting to raise 311 billion shillings by the end of this financial year. Already you're just about to lose 1 month, apart from the VAT on fuel. So how realistic is this, and what will have to happen if you run short of the revenue?
One is that the figures you are referring to are not correct. The figures, if you go to the current budget that we read and the current published budget, the revenue that we anticipate to raise in terms of taxes is 2.58, it's around 2.5 trillion Kenya
It's
shillings.
2.57 trillion, but the KRA has said the target for this financial year is 2.768.
You know, I'm referencing on the document I have, which is the budget or the appropriations bill or act. It is and allow me to quote figures without including the housing levy, because it will be much more neater.
Okay.
We anticipate to raise 2.5 trillion Kenya shillings. I think what you are including is A&A. A&A is around 349 billion Kenya shillings. I'm saying that because we can do two math, one without the housing levy and the one with. Why have I excluded the housing levy? It is because this tax is going to a specific, to achieve a specific aid. Whereas it is going to the consolidated fund, the plan is not to amalgamate the same with the other revenues. So the actual revenue that KRA will be raising is actually 2.56 trillion Kenya shillings. If you add that to A&A, around 349, and then you add the deficit, the grants of around 40 billion, that is why you actually arrive to a deficit of around 720 billion Kenya shillings. So those are the correct figures. Secondly, I want to disagree with majority of my panelists here. They've been talking about crowding out effect in terms of borrowing internally. You know, there is no better way of judging what you are doing but by looking at scenarios that have been where we are. Looking at the economies that would actually pass as benchmarks, and you look at the composition of debt, majority of them actually lean towards domestic. And there is a reason we are doing that as a country, for example. As you have actually stated clearly and even displayed, you have seen the ratings of the credit agencies. And if we had time, we would actually have explored also the condition and the circumstances of the international financial markets. And therefore, for any responsible government to be able to plan well, you cannot currently plan with external monies. And that is why, Dr. Rugo, you see in our composition of the 720 billion, 80% of that money we are anticipating to borrow locally. Locally, we have control over. Externally, you may not have a lot of leverage. I mean, you can only be swamped into the circumstances.
Even if that pushes out the private sector.
Now, I'm coming to that.
Yeah.
There is usually a general misconception when we appear in these kind of shows that the people in Treasury have never gone to school, and therefore they only pick figures and plant them in the budget. Ostensibly so, we have very good analysts and we have very good professionals in the National Treasury. Before we arrive to these 80%, we ought to be asking, why is it not 98%? Why is it not 78%? We sat down and we came to an equilibrium point where, yes, we are borrowing and squeezing internally, but to a point where we are not crowding out the private sector. So that has been taken care of. And I want to refer all of us here to check at the amount of money available in our banking arena to be lent out, so that then we can see the amount that is the government will be taking up in terms of especially boats, and we will be able to see enough more is remaining for the private sector. Okay. Then there is another issue that I want to wind up with, which it will be an injustice if I don't highlight it. We've been talking here about this tax and the other, about this revenue measure and the other. You should have given us time to also celebrate some of the achievements, which is critical to the discussion we are talking about. Number one, as we are in this current financial year, something unprecedented has happened, that we have been able to clear the entire shareable revenue allocation to all our counties. By the 30th of June, there is no 1 shilling area. We have been able to clear the entire CDF. It is unprecedented. You can go to the figures. There is no financial year where we crossed over, where CDF had been released to the last shilling. The same case in terms of the county monies or county funds. We can also celebrate that a third of our budget that we are talking about here is going to the children of Kenya in terms of education. We must celebrate also that we have been able to actually double the allocation to our tertiary education and especially universities. Health money we have been able to double from 15 to 30 billion. GSS capitation, we have taken it from 15 billion to 25 billion. We have been able to allocate an unprecedented amount of money to roads, which is actually 250 billion. And by the way, gas has fallen. The prices of gas are much lower than they were in June.
No, you're right. I know that for sure. I can confirm.
That will need another show for us to respond.
Yeah,
all right.
I thought
I heard the last one.
No.
Which are these other ones?
He has opened.
He has opened
that was
a
not
new
a last
conversation.
one.
I will not reopen.
That would need to be interrogated.
Open this. I just wanted to confirm that indeed the price of gas has gone down. As of the...
Please bring a feature tomorrow. The same way you brought Maandamano proper. Please bring a feature.
I will
Go
speak,
to Murang'a,
I'll speak to my assignment editor.
And all the other
but as of the release of funds to the counties, yes, it has been released, but the final shares were sent almost at the same time, the last 3 months or so, which...
That's what I'm saying. I think this requires a much more conversation.
Now you have to have rejoined us.
But anyway, let me take a look at the... I almost said shareable revenue. No, shareable tweets that have come to us at Citizen TV Kenya at Sam Gituku. The hashtag to use is the break. This is Okelo Molemo saying, to tame government's high appetite for borrowing, Constitution should be amended to make Treasury a fourth arm of government. The more we have Treasury that's under ambits of the executive, I guess, the more the public debt will exponentially rise with little or no corresponding development. Also, Kimayo Orpa, you're saying Kenya for now needs serious strategic plan in order to improve its economy, having in mind that its vision is becoming self-industrialized nation come 2030, that's its vision 2030. It's high time Kenyan leaders set aside political differences and focus on organization management. All right, Crispin Adams, you're saying the genesis of inflated public debt started in 2013, so the government should address the high cost without shifting blame, reduce taxes and levies on fuel and electricity to attract more investment, create and save jobs. And Sir Nixon Dugire, if we can all embrace our national anthem anchored on patriotism, we can really have a very beautiful country and enjoy living in it. We won't even struggle to overcome some negative energies like that of vengeance. And PST Waroi, I guess is Pastor Waroi. Today, President Ruto referred to Honorable Raila as my friend. And for the first time, I heard Honorable Raila call him President Ruto. We're headed to a peaceful season. Dialogue is good, but with very clear parameters and expected outcomes. All right, I have to thank you all. Now, Honorable Nyoro, yes, the tax targets, tax collection by KRA, the target is 2.768. That's the statement they shared. You have different figures. You said yours are the correct ones, but also we'll see what to do with the KRA figures. Thank you, Senator Okiya Mtata from Busia County, joining us virtually. Thank you.